She was rescued in a blizzard and woke up in the powerful judge's bed. He was a man who lived in a fortress of silence and law, his world a masterpiece of cold, perfect control. But one night, when the world was shrouded in white, she stumbled into his isolation and became the one beautiful, chaotic exception to all his rules. This is the story of the moment a blizzard fused two worlds, of the life or death choice that shattered an empire of solitude, and of the kiss, the one born of despair and forged in fire. Have you ever felt that attraction you couldn't explain, that chemical logic couldn't define? If you enjoy intense romance stories, subscribe to the channel and join our family. And I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Tell me in the comments. It all began with a blizzard, a breakdown, and a rescue that was never intended as an act of kindness. He didn't know in that moment, standing before the frail, snow-covered woman at his door, that he wasn't saving her. He himself was about to be saved. The world had vanished. For Clara Hayes, there was no road, no sky, no horizon. There was only the furious, hypnotic swirl of white and the bone-deep shudder of her ancient Jeep as it fought a losing battle against the blizzard. The wipers slashed frantically, clearing the windshield for a split second before it was swallowed again by the onslaught. She was a veterinarian, a healer. Her life was a series of quiet, noble battles fought in barns and on back roads, bringing comfort to creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. That sense of duty was a fire in her veins, and it was the only thing keeping her from pulling over. Hours ago, a call had come in. A panicked farmer, a prized mare in a difficult labor, miles deep in the winding mountain roads. The storm had been a warning then, a whisper of snow. Now it was a roar. "Just a little further, Bessie," she muttered to her Jeep, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Her breath plumed in the frigid air. The heater had given up an hour ago, surrendering to the impossible cold. She was running on the dregs of a thermos of coffee and the fierce, stubborn compassion that defined her. Her small clinic, built with a second mortgage and sheer willpower, barely broke even. Every dollar went back into medicine, into supplies, into forgiving the bills of families who couldn't afford to pay. There was nothing left for a new car or new tires or even a new winter coat. The one she wore was thin, its zipper broken. The end came without drama. Not a crash, but a slow, tired surrender. A final sputtering cough from the engine, a sickening lurch, and then silence. An absolute, profound silence, broken only by the screaming of the wind outside. Clara rested her forehead against the icy steering wheel. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat, but she shoved it down. Panic was a luxury. The farmer's house was supposed to be 2 miles ahead. Walking was insane. Staying was a death sentence. She pulled on her worn gloves, wrapped a thin scarf around her face, and stepped out of the Jeep. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The snow wasn't powder. It was a wall of tiny, sharp needles that stung her exposed skin. Within seconds, the Jeep was just a fading shape behind her. She was a ghost in a world of ghosts, guided only by the faint memory of the road and the desperate hope of seeing a light. Every step was a war. The snow was deep, a treacherous blanket hiding ice and uneven ground. Her legs burned, her lungs ached. The world became a dizzying vortex of white noise and white blindness. The thought of the mare, suffering and alone, was the only thing that kept her moving. But the cold was a patient predator. It seeped through her thin coat, through her jeans, turning her limbs to lead. Her movements became sluggish, her thoughts cloudy. The desperate drive to save a life began to fade, replaced by a strange, seductive peace, the promise of rest. She stumbled, her knee hitting a rock hidden beneath the snow. A sharp, searing pain shot up her leg. She cried out, but the sound was devoured by the storm. She tried to stand, but her body refused. The exhaustion was absolute, a crushing weight that pinned her to the frozen earth. "This is it," a quiet thought whispered. Her world narrowed to the small patch of snow in front of her face. The roar of the blizzard began to sound like a lullaby. Her eyelids grew heavy. Just for a minute, she thought. I'll just rest for a minute. As her vision blurred, a light flickered in the distance. A single golden square of light, impossibly warm and steady in the heart of the storm. A house, a cabin, hope, sharp and painful, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. With the last of her strength, she began to crawl. Dragging her injured leg, she clawed her way through the snow, her eyes fixed on that light. It was her entire universe. The crawl felt like an eternity. By the time she reached the source of the light, a massive, modern cabin built of dark wood and vast panes of glass, she was barely conscious. She saw the shape of a heavy wooden door, a final destination. She pulled herself up, her frozen fingers finding the rough wood, and knocked. Once. A weak, pathetic tap that was swallowed by the wind. She tried to knock again, but her arm wouldn't obey. The world tilted violently. The golden light fractured into 1,000 shimmering pieces. The last thing she registered was the sound of a heavy bolt being drawn, the door swinging inward, and the silhouette of a tall, imposing man framed against the warm light. And then, the cold, hard promise of rest was finally fulfilled. Judge Julian Croft lived a life of deliberate, absolute silence. His fortress was not a penthouse in the sky, but this sprawling, minimalist cabin carved into the side of a remote mountain, a sanctuary of stone, glass, and shadow. He had built it to be impenetrable, a place where the chaos of the world he judged could not reach him. He was in hiding, not from the law. He was the law, but from its consequences. 6 months ago, he had presided over the trial of a brutal crime syndicate. His verdict had sent its kingpin to prison for life, but not before the man had looked him in the eye and delivered a calm, chilling promise of revenge against anyone Julian held dear. Julian, a man with no family left, had taken the threat personally. He had walled himself off from the world, his only companion the silence and the weight of his own judgments. A rare trip to the small town at the base of the mountain for supplies had been a calculated risk. He'd seen the storm warnings, but his discipline and control had told him he could beat it. He had, barely. Now the blizzard raged outside, sealing him in his self-imposed prison just as he preferred. He was standing by the massive stone fireplace, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand, watching the flames dance. The fire was the only chaotic thing he allowed in his life. He was a man of central heating, of predictable, regulated temperatures, but the fire was an old habit, a primal comfort. That's when he heard it, or thought he heard it, a soft, muffled thump against the door, almost lost in the howl of the wind. Impossible. No one came up this road. No one could come up this road in this storm. He dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, a branch hitting the house. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. The silence of the cabin settled around him again. Then it came again, fainter this time. A scraping sound. Every instinct honed by years on the bench, by reading liars and sensing danger, screamed at him. This was wrong. This was an anomaly in his perfectly controlled world. He placed the glass on the mantelpiece, his movements precise, and walked to the door. He didn't turn on the porch light. He looked through the small peephole. All he could see was a swirling wall of white. His hand went to the heavy deadbolt. This was a mistake. He was hiding for a reason. Opening the door was breaking his most important rule: no contact, no witnesses, no attachments. But the scraping sound had been desperate. It was the sound of a living thing. Against his better judgment, against every logical protocol that had kept him safe, he drew the bolt. The wind tore the heavy door from his hand, slamming it open. A blast of snow and ice filled the entryway, and there, collapsed on his doorstep, was a woman, a small snow-covered heap, barely recognizable as human. He stared, his mind struggling to process the impossible sight. A woman. Here. He should close the door. Call the mountain rescue, if the lines were even working. Delegate. But she was so utterly defeated. Her face, pale and tinged with blue, was turned toward him. Her dark hair was fanned out, frozen to the welcome mat. One of her hands was still weakly reaching for the door. He moved. The decision wasn't logical. It was visceral, a primal command that bypassed the judge and came from the man. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Her body was terrifyingly cold, her clothes frozen stiff. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. He laid her on the thick bearskin rug in front of the fireplace, the place where the warmth was most intense. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, did an analytical sweep. Hypothermia, severe, possible injury. He saw the way she favored one leg. He was meticulous. He began to work, his movements economical and efficient, the way he approached a legal brief. He peeled off her frozen gloves, revealing fingers that were waxy and white. He He gently removed her thin, useless coat and the scarf crusted with ice. Her clothes beneath were soaked through. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Modesty was a luxury she couldn't afford. Survival was the only verdict that mattered now. He retrieved a ridiculously soft, heavy cashmere blanket from a nearby chest and, with practiced detachment, stripped away her cold, wet clothes, immediately wrapping her in the thick, dry folds. Her skin was like ice. He looked down at the woman cocooned on his floor. A stranger, a variable he had not anticipated. She was a splash of raw, human chaos in the heart of his sterile sanctuary. Her presence was a violation of his solitude, a catastrophic breach of his security. And yet, as he looked at her pale, still face, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, he felt a strange, unwelcome stirring in the silent chambers of his heart. It wasn't pity. It was something far more dangerous. It was responsibility. He walked to a heavy oak cabinet and retrieved a medical kit. He found a pulse, weak but steady. He wrapped her in 2 more blankets, propping her feet up slightly. He knew the protocol. Gradual warming, no sudden heat. He stood and looked down at her, a frown creasing his brow. The immediate crisis was managed, but a new one had just begun. He had a woman in his house, a woman who, when she woke up, would have questions, a woman who would know where he was. For now, she was just a body, a problem to be solved. He could maintain that distance. He looked at the empty, king-sized bed in the master loft, visible from the great room. The bearskin rug was not enough. To fight this level of cold, she needed to be enveloped in warmth. With a deep, weary sigh, he carefully lifted her again. She murmured something, a faint, incoherent sound, and her head lolled against his shoulder. Her scent, a faint trace of something clean and wild, like winter herbs, filled his senses. It was a disturbingly intimate sensation. He carried her up the open staircase to the loft, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows around them. He pulled back the heavy down comforter on his bed, a bed that had been empty for years, and laid her down in the center of it. He pulled the covers up to her chin, tucking her in with an efficiency that felt like a betrayal of the intimacy of the act. He stood by the bed for a long moment, watching her, an anonymous woman, a storm-tossed piece of chaos, now lying in the very heart of his ordered world, in his bed. The judge in him saw a complication, a risk, a future cross-examination. But the man saw only her, warmth. That was the first thing Clara registered, not a gentle warmth, but a profound, heavy heat that seemed to sink into her bones, chasing away a chill so deep she hadn't realized it had almost claimed her. She was floating in a dark, quiet ocean of comfort, cocooned in something impossibly soft. It smelled of cedar, old books, and a faint masculine scent of clean spice, like cloves. Her body ached, a dull, throbbing pain that centered in her knee, but the gnawing cold was gone. For a moment, she stayed adrift in that blissful state, refusing to surface, but consciousness was a relentless tide. Her eyelids fluttered open. She wasn't met with the familiar cracked plaster of her apartment ceiling. She was staring up at a vast, vaulted ceiling of dark, exposed wooden beams. The air was still and silent, the only sound the distant, mournful howl of the wind and the soft, rhythmic crackle of a fire. She focused, and the room snapped into terrifying, magnificent reality. She was in a loft, in a bed so large it felt like its own continent. The blankets were heavy, luxurious down. The room itself was an architectural masterpiece of masculine elegance, a world of dark wood, slate-grey stone and brushed steel. Through a colossal floor-to-ceiling window at the far end of the great room below, she could see nothing but the swirling, hypnotic chaos of the blizzard. It wasn't merely a cabin, it was a fortress. It was power made manifest in timber and stone. And then she saw him. He was standing downstairs in the great room, his back to her. He was by the massive stone fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, staring into the flames. He was a tall, imposing silhouette in a simple, dark cashmere sweater and trousers that fit with a precision that spoke of quiet expense. Even from this distance, he radiated an aura of severe, unshakable authority. He had the profile of a stoic king from an old painting, sharp, strong, utterly unyielding. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was his. He owned it. A rush of fragmented memories returned. The dying jeep, the biting cold, the desperate crawl, the golden light, the opening door. This man, he had saved her. She tried to sit up. A bolt of white-hot pain shot through her knee, and a wave of dizziness washed over her, forcing her back against the pillows with a soft gasp. The sound, though quiet, cut through the silence like a knife. He turned instantly. Not a slow, casual turn, but a sharp, deliberate movement. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, locked onto hers across the expanse of the room. They were intelligent, analytical, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Don't move," he commanded. His voice was not a suggestion, it was a verdict. It was a deep, resonant baritone that echoed in the quiet space, a voice accustomed to absolute obedience. He strode toward the open staircase, his movements economical and precise. He didn't rush, yet he covered the ground with an intimidating grace. As he climbed the stairs to the loft, she got her first clear look at his face. It was a handsome face, carved from granite, a strong jaw, a straight nose, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the eyes of a man who saw everything, analyzed everything, and judged everything. He carried a small glass of water. He didn't offer a gentle inquiry or a comforting word. He offered a solution. "You collapsed on my doorstep from severe hypothermia and exhaustion," he stated, his voice as clinical as a doctor's report. He stopped a few feet from the bed, maintaining a careful, deliberate distance. "I brought you inside. You have been unconscious for several hours. How do you feel?" Clara blinked, overwhelmed. This man wasn't just a good Samaritan. He was an imposing, almost terrifying force of nature. My knee," she managed, her voice a reedy whisper. "I fell." "I am aware," he said, his gaze flicking down to the lump under the blankets where her knee was. "I assessed the injury. There is significant swelling and bruising. It may be dislocated or fractured. We will not know until the storm passes and I can get you to a doctor." His pragmatism was a cold slap. He spoke of her body as if it were evidence in a case. Who are you?" she asked, the question feeling impossibly small in the vast room. He paused, his expression unreadable. He looked at her as if she were a complicated legal argument he was still dissecting. "My name is Julian Croft," he said. He didn't offer a title or a background, just the name, but it felt heavy, laden with an untold weight. "You are in my private residence. The blizzard has made the mountain roads impassable. You will be staying here until it is safe to leave." He held out the glass of water. "Drink this, slowly." His patience was an active, heavy thing. Clara, a woman who prided herself on her fierce independence, felt a sudden, humiliating rush of vulnerability. She was injured, trapped, and utterly at the mercy of this cold, commanding stranger. "Thank you," she mumbled, taking the glass with a trembling hand. The words felt pitifully inadequate. You saved my life." "I prevented a death on my property," Julian corrected instantly, his eyes narrowing slightly as if the concept of heroism offended his sense of logic. It would have presented a significant administrative and legal complication. His blunt, cold pragmatism was like a wall of ice. He saw her not as a person, but as a potential liability, an unforeseen factor in his controlled existence. She drank the water, the cool liquid a balm to her dry throat. As she handed the glass back, her fingers brushed against his. A jolt, like static electricity, shot through them both. It was a tiny, fleeting shock of human contact in the cold, sterile air. He withdrew his hand as if he'd been burned, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I need to go," she insisted, pushing herself up on her elbows, ignoring the screaming protest from her knee. "The farmer, Mrs. Gable's mare. She's in labor. I have to get there." Julian's mouth, a thin, controlled line, barely moved. "No, you will not. You are in no condition to move, and even if you were to step outside now would be suicide. Whatever situation the animal is in, it will have to resolve itself without you." His tone was not up for negotiation. It was a final, logical declaration. Clara knew instinctively that arguing was futile. This man was accustomed to his word being law. But the thought of the suffering mare, of the promise she had made, ignited her stubborn spirit. "You don't understand," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its usual strength. "It's my job. It's what I do. I can't just lie here." He looked at her, and for the first time a flicker of something other than analysis crossed his face. It might have been curiosity, or perhaps it was annoyance. "Though your job is irrelevant in the face of these circumstances," he said, his voice dropping, each word delivered with quiet, unshakable force. "Your only responsibility right now is to stay alive. You will remain in this bed. You will rest. And you will not argue with me again." He turned to leave. The dismissal was absolute. After saving her life, he was treating her like an unruly child, a temporary inconvenience to be managed. "Wait!" she called out, her voice sharp. "My things! My bag! My phone!" He paused at the top of the stairs, turning his head slightly. "Your belongings are downstairs by the fire, drying. Your phone is useless. The storm has knocked out all cellular service." "I need my bag," she insisted. "My medical kit is in there." He considered her for a long moment, his eyes weighing her words. Then, with a curt nod, he descended the stairs. He returned a moment later with her worn leather satchel. He held it between two fingers, as if it might contaminate his pristine environment. He placed it on the floor beside the bed, well within her reach, but without getting any closer himself. "Rest, Ms." He trailed off, realizing he didn't know her name. "Clara," she supplied. "Clara Hayes." "Rest, Miss Hayes," he said. The use of her name felt like a cold, formal announcement. "I will bring you some broth later. Do not attempt to leave this loft." He turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the wooden stairs, leaving her alone in the vast, intimidating silence of his home. Alone, Clara sank back into the pillows. The shock and the cold began to recede, replaced by a deep, gnawing sense of dislocation. Who was this man, Julian Croft? He had the bearing of a king and the emotional distance of an iceberg. She had been plucked from a blizzard and placed into a situation that felt just as cold and dangerous. She opened her satchel, the familiar smell of antiseptic and leather a small comfort. She found what she was looking for, a high-strength analgesic. Her hands were still clumsy, but she managed to inject a dose into her thigh. The relief would take time. She looked around the loft again. It was immaculate, sterile, beautiful, and utterly devoid of any personal touch. No photos, no books casually left open, no small trinkets. It wasn't a home. It was a holding cell, albeit a luxurious one. She was a creature of chaos and connection. She thrived on the messy, unpredictable joy of healing animals, the smell of hay and clean fur, the grateful smiles of their owners. He was a being of logic, silence, and order. She pulled the heavy comforter tighter around her, the borrowed warmth feeling like a debt she could never repay. He had been so quick to frame his actions as liability mitigation. But what else was it? A transaction to avoid a complication. A new wave of pain from her knee made her wince. She was trapped with a man who looked at her as if she were a flaw in his perfect, silent world. A man who had rescued her from a blizzard, only to trap her in a storm of his own making. And the most terrifying part? She was in his bed. The thought sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a shiver of pure, undiluted awareness. Of him. Of the dangerous magnetic pull of the man who was now her reluctant warden. The next morning the blizzard still raged, a relentless curtain of white that erased the world outside. The cabin was an island adrift in a sea of snow, the silence inside a heavy, charged thing. Clara awoke to two realities, the persistent, dull ache in her knee and a fierce, gnawing hunger. The analgesic had helped, but movement was still a carefully negotiated truce with pain. She was a guest, a patient, a prisoner, she wasn't sure which, but she would not be helpless. With grim determination, she swung her legs over the side of the massive bed. The floor was cold stone, a shock to her system. Using the sturdy bedpost for support, she tested her weight on her injured leg. Pain, sharp and immediate, shot up to her hip. She grit her teeth, a low hiss escaping her lips. She was a veterinarian. She knew how to push past pain. This was no different. Limping heavily, she made her way to the edge of the loft, her hand trailing along the cold steel railing. Down below, the great room was empty. The fire had been banked, its embers glowing with a soft orange pulse. A single empty whiskey glass sat on the mantelpiece, the only evidence of its owner, of Julian. The kitchen, a sleek expanse of dark wood, stainless steel, and black granite, was visible from her vantage point. It was as immaculate and soulless as the rest of the house, but it meant food. The journey down the open staircase was a slow, agonizing descent. Each step sent a fresh wave of pain through her leg, but with every step, A piece of her stubborn independence returned. She would not be confined to his bed, a passive recipient of his cold, pragmatic charity. She found the kitchen to be a fortress of ruthless efficiency. Everything was hidden behind seamless cabinet doors. There were no cheerful magnets on the refrigerator, no stray crumbs on the counter, no clutter. It took her 10 minutes of opening and closing silent, heavy drawers to find a mug, coffee, and a pan. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee soon filled the sterile air, a warm, fragrant act of rebellion. It was followed by the sizzle of eggs in a pan. For the first time since she'd arrived, the house smelled like a home. She was just sliding the eggs onto a plate when he appeared. He didn't make a sound. One moment the room was empty, the next he was there, leaning against the doorframe of what she assumed was his study. He was already dressed in another perfectly tailored sweater and dark trousers. His hair was damp, as if from a recent shower. He watched her, his expression unreadable, his stormy eyes taking in the scene. Her limping in his kitchen, wearing a set of his own grey sweats he must have left for her, filling his silent space with the mundane, chaotic scent of breakfast. "I told you not to leave the loft," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a reminder of a rule that had been broken. "And I told you I couldn't just lie there," she countered, her voice steady. She didn't look at him, focusing on her plate. "I was hungry." He walked slowly into the kitchen, his presence a sudden, heavy anchor in the space. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace that made her acutely aware of every move she made. He stopped at the opposite side of the massive granite island, placing a deliberate and intimidating distance between them. "There is a service bell by the bed," he stated. "You were to use it. The staff quarters have a generator. I would have brought you whatever you required." "I don't require serving, Mr. Croft," she said, finally meeting his gaze, her chin held high. "I require the use of my own 2 hands." He considered her, his eyes sweeping over her, from her determined expression down to her injured leg. "Your stubbornness will only aggravate your injury. It is illogical." "Maybe," she replied, taking a defiant bite of egg. "Or maybe it's the only thing that will heal it. Some things can't be fixed by lying still and waiting for orders." A faint, almost imperceptible muscle twitched in his jaw. She was challenging him in his own domain, questioning his absolute control. Before he could respond, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. A scratching. A desperate, frantic scratching at the main door, followed by a low, mournful whine. Clara froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Her professional instincts kicked in immediately. That was the sound of an animal in distress. Julian's face closed off completely. "Ignore it," he commanded, his voice sharp. "It is a stray. It will move on." "It's freezing out there," Clara said, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It's been out in that blizzard all night. It won't last another hour." The scratching came again, weaker this time, punctuated by a pained yelp. "This mountain is full of wild animals, Miss Hayes," Julian said, his voice like ice. "Coyotes, bears." "Opening that door is an unnecessary risk. We are not getting involved." Clara pushed her plate away. "I am getting involved." She started for the door, her limp more pronounced now. Julian moved with startling speed, intercepting her, his body a solid, unyielding wall blocking her path. "You will go back upstairs and finish your breakfast," he ordered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Get out of my way," she hissed, trying to push past him. His arm shot out, his hand closing around her bicep. It wasn't a violent grip, but it was incredibly strong, a manacle of controlled power. The contact was electric, a jolt of heat that shot through her entire body. His touch was warm, firm, and possessive. They stood there for a heart-stopping moment, locked in a battle of wills. His stormy eyes bored into hers, searching, demanding. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of defiance and a strange, terrifying awareness of his proximity. She could feel the hard muscle of his arm, smell that clean, spicy scent on his skin. "Let go of me," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and something else, something she refused to name. From outside, the animal gave one last, heartbreaking cry. It broke the spell. With a curse under his breath, Julian released her. "Fine," he bit out, his voice tight with fury, "but you will stay back. I will handle it." He strode to the door and pulled it open just enough to see. A large matted shape, covered in snow and ice, was huddled on the welcome mat. A big, golden-haired dog, a mix of retriever and something else, looked up at him with eyes full of pain and exhaustion. Its paw was bleeding, leaving a faint pink stain on the fresh snow. With a look of profound annoyance, Julian opened the door wider. The dog limped inside, collapsing onto the rug, shivering violently. Clara was already moving. All thoughts of her own pain vanished, replaced by the singular focus of a healer. "Get me my satchel," she commanded, her voice taking on its own quiet authority, "and towels, and a bowl of warm water. Now." For the first time since she'd arrived, Julian obeyed without question. He watched, a silent, imposing shadow as she worked. She was transformed. The defiant, stubborn woman was gone, replaced by a creature of incredible grace and focus. Her hands, which had trembled holding a water glass, were now steady and sure as she gently cleaned the dog's wound. She murmured to the animal, her voice a low, soothing melody that seemed to calm its shivering. She worked with an intense, quiet passion that was mesmerizing. Julian found himself captivated. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the gentle, expert way her fingers moved through the dog's matted fur, the raw, unshielded empathy in her eyes. He, a man who dealt in logic and facts, was watching a master of an entirely different art, the art of healing, of mending what was broken. She found a deep gash in the dog's paw, likely from a sharp piece of ice. With a practiced efficiency that Julian, a connoisseur of expertise, couldn't help but admire, she disinfected the wound, applied a salve, and wrapped the paw in clean gauze from her kit. Throughout the entire process, she never once looked at him. She was in her own world, a world of instinct and compassion that he could only observe from the outside. When she was finished, the dog licked her hand and rested its head in her lap, with a deep, trusting sigh. Clara stroked its head, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. The smile lit up her face, a sudden, breathtaking splash of warmth in the cold, grey light of the room. Julian felt something shift inside him, a tectonic plate deep in his soul that had been dormant for years. It was a strange, unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was admiration. "He will need antibiotics," she said, finally looking up at him, her eyes clear and direct. "And he's severely dehydrated, but he will be fine." "You are a veterinarian," he stated. It wasn't a question. He had connected the pieces, her talk of a mare, her medical kit, her skill. "I am," she confirmed. She looked down at her own wrapped knee, then back at him. "It seems we are both your unwilling patients now." He noticed for the first time a small clean cut on the back of his own hand, just below the knuckles, likely from when he had carried her inside, brushing against the rough doorframe. He had ignored it. It was a minor, irrelevant detail. She noticed it too. Her gaze dropped to his hand. Before he could react, she reached out, her fingers gently taking his hand. Her touch was soft, but her grip was surprisingly firm. It was the touch of a healer, clinical and yet profoundly intimate. "You're bleeding," she whispered. She held his much larger hand in her small ones, turning it over to inspect the cut. Her head was bowed, a curtain of dark hair obscuring her face. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his skin. His heart, which he had long considered a purely functional organ, began to beat a heavy, chaotic rhythm against his ribs. He watched, frozen, as she took a sterile wipe from her kit and began to gently clean the cut. He was a man who commanded courtrooms, who made billionaires tremble, who had not allowed another human being to touch him with such gentleness in over a decade. And here he was, being tended to by a stubborn, chaotic veterinarian in the middle of a blizzard, with a stray dog asleep at her feet. His entire world, his entire fortress of control, was being quietly, systematically dismantled. And the most terrifying part was, for a fleeting, insane moment, he didn't want her to stop. Julian retreated. The moment she finished tending to the cut on his hand, her touch lingering for a fraction of a second too long, he pulled away, as if her fingers were embers. He didn't say a word. He simply turned, his broad back a sudden, impenetrable wall, and strode into his study, closing the heavy oak door behind him with a soft, definitive click. The sound echoed in the vast room, a clear and final dismissal. Clara was left in the silence, her heart hammering. The warmth of his skin was still imprinted on her fingertips. She looked down at the big golden dog, who had watched the entire exchange with intelligent eyes. "Well," she whispered, stroking his soft fur, "I guess we know who's in charge." The dog responded with a deep, happy sigh and nudged his head against her, as if to say, "You are." A new, delicate truce formed in the silent cabin. The blizzard showed no signs of stopping, encasing them in a world of white. They were two satellites trapped in a shared, unwilling orbit. Clara named the dog Storm, a choice that earned her a long, unblinking stare from Julian when she announced it, but no verbal protest. The days fell into a strange, silent rhythm, a ballet of careful avoidance and charged proximity. Storm, blissfully unaware of the tension, became the chaotic bridge between their two worlds. He would limp from his comfortable spot by the fire to lay his heavy head in Julian's lap, a breach of protocol that Julian endured with a stiff, pained tolerance that was almost comical. And then there was the coffee. Every morning Clara would navigate the stairs, her knee slowly beginning to heal, and make a pot of strong black coffee. She would pour 2 mugs, one for herself and one she would leave on the edge of the granite island, a silent daily offering. Julian would emerge from his study, his face a mask of cool indifference, and pick it up without a word of thanks. But he always drank it. The small ritual became their only form of communication, a quiet, steaming treaty in their Cold War. He in turn would leave a tray of food outside her loft door, simple, nourishing meals of soup and bread, a silent, pragmatic acknowledgement of his duty as her warden. But the silence was the loudest thing in the house. It was a living entity, filled with unspoken questions and the palpable humming energy between them. Clara found herself watching him. She watched the way he moved, with a contained, powerful grace that hinted at a strength he kept ruthlessly in check. She watched the way he'd stare into the fire for hours, his face carved in shadow, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. He wasn't just a recluse, he was a man haunted. One evening, the third of their confinement, the tension finally snapped. The generator that powered the lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the cabin into a sudden, profound darkness, broken only by the ethereal blue glow of the snow outside the windows and the warm, dancing light of the fire. Clara, who had been reading on the sofa with Storm at her feet, gave a small gasp. "Stay where you are," Julian's voice commanded from the darkness, startlingly close. He had been in his study. He must have been on his way out when the power failed. "The backup generator should engage. If not, I will handle it." She could hear him moving, the soft sound of his footsteps on the stone floor. He was a shadow moving through the firelight. He knelt by a control panel on the wall, his broad shoulders and the sharp line of his profile thrown into stark relief by the flames. The backup generator sputtered, but failed to catch. "It appears the fuel line has frozen," he stated, his voice calm, analytical, as if discussing a minor legal technicality. He stood and turned to face her. "We have the fire, and there are candles." He moved with an unnerving familiarity in the dark, retrieving thick, cream-colored candles from a chest and lighting them with a long match from the hearth. He placed them around the great room, and soon the space was filled with a soft, intimate glow. The flickering light softened the room's hard edges, making the vast space feel smaller, more like a sanctuary. It also made him seem less like a judge and more like a man. He didn't return to his study. Instead, he took his usual spot by the fire, leaning against the mantel, his arms crossed over his chest. The silence that fell between them was different now. The darkness had stripped away some of their armor, leaving them exposed. "Why are you here, Julian?" Clara asked, her voice soft in the quiet. It was the first time she had used his first name without him correcting her first. "Really here? A man like you don't just take a vacation in the middle of nowhere during the worst blizzard of the decade." He was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the flames. The firelight danced in their stormy depths. "I value my privacy, Miss Hayes," he finally said. "I'm a good keeper of secrets," she countered gently. "Animals tell me things they tell no one else. They know I won't judge." A humorless smile touched his lips for a fleeting second. "I am the one who judges, not the one who is judged." "Everyone is judged by someone," she murmured. "Even judges." He turned his head then, his gaze locking onto hers in the flickering light. For the first time, his eyes held not just analysis, but a raw, intense curiosity. He saw the fire in her own eyes, the fierce, unshielded empathy she wore like a second skin. "Why veterinary medicine?" he asked, the shift in topic a clear deflection, but an engagement nonetheless. "You have a sharp mind. You could have chosen a more lucrative profession." She shrugged, her pride a quiet, steady thing. Because life is precious. All life. And I got tired of a world that only values things that come with a price tag. I wanted to help things that couldn't help themselves. It's important work, Julian. Alejandro, he corrected her, his voice a low, almost inaudible murmur. Wait, no, that was the other story. His mind seemed to glitch. The slip was so fast, so bizarre, he covered it instantly. My apologies, old case. My name is Julian. Clara tilted her head, a small frown on her face. The slip was strange, a crack in his perfect composure. It made him, for a second, human. Important work is often the least rewarded, he continued, his voice regaining its steady cadence. And the most dangerous. Danger doesn't frighten me, she said softly. Loneliness does. The words hung in the air between them, a quiet, devastating accusation. She was talking about him, his isolation, his self-imposed exile. She saw it. She saw him. The air crackled. The attraction, which had been simmering beneath the surface of their polite hostilities, flared into an undeniable, ardent heat. They were closer than they had ever been, the physical distance across the room meaningless in the sudden, suffocating intimacy of the moment. He pushed off the mantle and took a step toward her, then another. He moved like a man in a trance, drawn by a force he couldn't control. He stopped in front of the sofa where she sat, looming over her, a magnificent shadowed figure against the fire. "You should be afraid of me, Clara," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly confession. "Why?" she whispered back, her breath catching in her throat. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him. "Because you're powerful, or because you're alone?" He stared down at her, his face a battleground of conflicting emotions. Desire, stark and fierce, warred with a cold, habitual control. She could see the struggle in the tight line of his jaw, in the depths of his tormented eyes. He wanted her. The realization was a shock, a bolt of lightning that shot through her body, leaving a trail of heat in its wake. He leaned down, his hand coming up to hover just inches from her face. She could feel the heat radiating from his palm. She didn't flinch. She didn't breathe. His gaze dropped to her lips. And then he pulled back, abruptly, as if he'd touched a live wire. "The generator needs to be fixed," he said, his voice tight, clipped. He turned away from her, and the moment was shattered. The intimate sanctuary became a cold, vast room once more. He retrieved a heavy-duty flashlight and a toolkit and disappeared into the storm without another word, leaving Clara with a wildly beating heart and the lingering phantom heat of his presence. She was hurt, but she was also an artist of the soul. She understood boundaries, but she also understood that his harsh retreat wasn't about her. It was a consequence of a deep, unaddressed wound. The next day, the storm had lessened to a gentle, steady snowfall. The power was back on. An oppressive, formal silence had descended on the cabin once more. Julian was locked in his study, the door a clear and impenetrable barrier. Clara's knee was better. She could walk now with only a slight limp. Her curiosity, a trait as stubborn as her independence, was gnawing at her. She needed to understand the man who had pulled her from the jaws of death only to keep her at arm's length. She found herself standing before the door to his study. She knew she shouldn't. It was an invasion of the one space he had claimed as his own, but she couldn't help it. She needed to understand the ghost that haunted his eyes. Gently she turned the handle. The door was unlocked. The room was a cathedral of law and order. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound legal texts. His desk was a vast expanse of polished mahogany, neat and organized. It was exactly what she expected, except for one thing. In the corner of the room, behind a leather armchair, was a cello. It was a beautiful instrument, its dark wood glowing with a rich, deep luster, but it was covered in a thin layer of dust. Its bow was still in its case. It was clearly expensive, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, but it was sitting there silent and unused, a monument to a forgotten passion. She walked over to it, her fingers tracing the elegant curve of its body, wiping away a streak of dust. A man of such rigid control, of cold logic, playing an instrument of such soul-stirring, passionate music? It didn't fit. It was the first real clue to the man behind the judge, a glimpse into a life where emotion hadn't been outlawed. "What are you doing in here?" His voice, cold as the grave, cut through the silence. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. He was standing in the doorway, his face a thunderous mask of fury. The controlled, analytical man was gone, replaced by a stranger with raw, dangerous anger burning in his eyes. I was just looking," she stammered. "This room is private," he bit out, each word a chip of ice. He strode into the room, his presence sucking all the air from it. He stopped in front of her, forcing her to step back until her legs hit the armchair. He was trapping her, his body a cage. "There are walls for a reason, Ms. Hayes. You do not have the jurisdiction to tear them down." "It's beautiful," she said softly, looking at the cello. "Do you play?" The innocent question was like a lit match to gasoline. "That is none of your concern," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You have exceeded the boundaries of my hospitality. You are a guest here, a temporary complication. You are not entitled to my history, my privacy, or my life. Do you understand?" He was close, so close she could see the flecks of silver in his stormy eyes. The anger radiating from him was a palpable force, but beneath it she saw something else. Pain, a deep, profound, and devastating pain. The cello wasn't just an instrument, it was a wound, and she had just pressed her fingers directly into it. He did not kick her out. He did something far worse. He vanished. Julian retreated so completely into himself that he became a ghost in his own home. He locked the door to his study and did not emerge, not even for the silent ritual of their morning coffee. Clara was left utterly alone in the vast, silent cabin with Storm as her only companion. The heavy, charged silence of the early days was gone, replaced by a cold, empty void that was infinitely more painful. She had not just crossed a line, she had trespassed on sacred, sorrowful ground. Hurt, but more determined than ever, Clara knew she couldn't leave things like this. She was a healer, and she saw a wound in him so deep it was festering, poisoning him from the inside out. He had built his fortress of law and logic to protect himself, but it was also a tomb. She spent the entire next day on a piece of art that was solely for him. She didn't have charcoal or paint, but she had seen the fireplace tools, the way the soot collected on the hearthstone. She found a stack of pristine, cream-colored legal paper on a side table. It felt like a sacrilege, but it was necessary. Using a piece of burnt wood from the fireplace, she began to draw. She didn't draw a scene, she didn't draw his eyes, she drew his hands. One hand was clenched into a fist, a study in control, tension, and unyielding power. The knuckles were white, the sinews taut, the hand of the judge holding the world at bay. The other hand was open, its long, elegant fingers slightly curved, hovering over the strings of a cello that wasn't there. It was a hand full of longing, of remembered passion, of a devastating unspoken loss. It was the hand of the musician, the artist, the man. The two hands didn't touch, but the space between them crackled with the story of his entire life, the man he was, and the man he had forced himself to forget. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long blue shadows across the snow, she slipped the drawing under the door of his study. She didn't knock. The art was the only message she could send. It was a confession that she had seen him, an apology for the intrusion, and an invitation to honesty. She spent the next hour in a state of nervous tension, waiting, for yelling, for the door to be thrown open, for anything, but there was only silence. Finally, just as darkness fell, the door opened. Julian stood in the doorway, the drawing held in his hand. His face was pale, his expression stripped bare of all its defenses. The anger was gone. The cold control was gone. All that was left was a raw, profound devastation. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw the full, crushing weight of his sorrow. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't a question of her identity. It was a question of her ability to see into the darkest corners of his soul. Before she could answer, a new sound broke the silence, a low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump from the distance. It grew steadily louder, a mechanical heartbeat in the wilderness. A helicopter. Julian looked past her out the great window. "They're here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. He had obviously called for rescue as soon as the storm had broken enough for a signal to get through. Her time was up. He didn't look at her again. He simply walked to the fireplace and placed the drawing of his hands gently on the mantelpiece, leaning it against the stone. A quiet acknowledgement. A memorial. The rest was a blur of efficiency. The helicopter landed in a maelstrom of snow 100 yards from the cabin. 2 paramedics, bundled in orange, came to the door. Julian spoke to them in a low, authoritative voice, explaining the situation with clinical detachment. They put her knee in a brace and helped her out into the blinding, churning snow. She looked back once. Julian was standing in the doorway, a tall, solitary figure framed against the warm light of his home. He was a king returned to his empty, silent castle. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in his she saw a universe of unspoken words. Then the helicopter door slid shut, sealing him away in his gilded cage. The flight to the small-town hospital was short. The doctor confirmed it. A bad dislocation and a hairline fracture. She would be on crutches for weeks, but she would heal. The entire time, a quiet, professional man in a dark suit, clearly one of Julian's people, handled everything. He paid her medical bills in cash, arranged for her jeep to be towed and repaired, and handed her the keys to a rental car. When she was finally discharged, the man handed her a thick envelope. "From Mr. Croft," he said, his face impassive. Inside, she found a cashier's check for a staggering amount of money, enough to keep her clinic afloat for years, enough to finally get out of debt, enough to live without the constant grinding struggle, and with it, a single, typed note. "This is not a charity. It is a settlement for the administrative complication and potential liability. Do not attempt to contact me again." It was the coldest, most brutal dismissal she had ever experienced. He was paying her for her silence. He was buying back his solitude. He was erasing her from his life with a bank draft. The pain in her heart was infinitely worse than the pain in her knee. She returned to her life, but it was irrevocably altered. Her small apartment seemed smaller, her work less fulfilling. The world felt muted, drained of the intense, vibrant color that had existed in that cabin. She tore up the check. She would not be his liability. She would not be his dirty secret. She threw herself into her work, the familiar comfort of healing animals her only antidote to the memory of the cold, haunted judge. But every night she would dream of stormy eyes, of the phantom touch of his hand on her bicep, of the silent, mournful cello in the corner of his room. Julian, meanwhile, was disintegrating. The cabin was more silent than ever. The drawing of his hands remained on the mantelpiece. He couldn't look at it, and he couldn't bring himself to move it. He couldn't sleep. He would stare at the empty spot on the hearth where Storm, the dog, had lain, and feel a hollow ache. The paramedics had taken the dog, promising to get it to a local shelter. Another piece of chaos neatly removed. He realized he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had traded the risk of being seen for the guaranteed torment of solitude. He had tried to control the variable of her, and the price was his sanity. His world was in perfect, silent order, and he was completely, utterly broken. About a month after he sent her away, Julian was forced to return to the city. A high-profile appeal demanded his presence. He hated the city, the noise, the chaos, the people. He retreated to his sterile, empty apartment, a place even more soulless than his cabin. One evening, unable to bear the silence, he went for a walk. He found himself in a part of the city he rarely visited, a quiet neighborhood of small shops and brownstones. He passed a small, brightly lit storefront, Hayes Veterinary Clinic. His heart stopped. He stood across the street, a ghost in the shadows, and watched. He saw her through the window. She was laughing, her face animated and full of life, as she handed a small kitten back to a little girl. She was beautiful. She was whole. She was everything he wasn't. And as he watched, another man came up behind her, placing a friendly hand on her shoulder. He was tall, handsome, wearing scrubs. A colleague. Clara turned and smiled at him, a warm, easy smile that Julian had never seen. A smile she had never given him. A savage, primitive jealousy, an emotion he hadn't felt in 20 years, tore through him. It was illogical. It was irrational. It was unbearable. She had moved on. She was healing, while he was still trapped in the blizzard. He turned and walked away, his fists clenched at his sides. The judge had made his ruling. He had sent her away. But the man was serving a life sentence. What he didn't see was the moment after, when Clara's smile faded as soon as the colleague walked away. He didn't see the way her gaze drifted to the window, a distant, haunted look in her eyes as she stared out into the night, as if searching for something she knew she would never find again. 2 months after the blizzard, Clara's life had found a new, fragile rhythm. She had thrown herself into her work with a ferocity that left her exhausted each night, a welcome state that kept the dreams of a silent cabin and stormy eyes at bay. Her knee had healed, leaving only a faint ache on cold days, a physical ghost of a memory she was trying desperately to forget. She had even adopted a dog. One afternoon, on a whim, she had visited the local shelter. And there, in a large pen, was a big golden-haired retriever mix with a slight limp and intelligent knowing eyes. Storm. He had bounded towards her, his tail wagging, and it felt not like a choice, but a reunion. Bringing him home was like bringing back a piece of the storm, a piece of that intense, charged world she had lost. One evening she was working late at the clinic, updating patient files. Storm was asleep at her feet. It was a quiet, peaceful night. The street outside was dark and empty. The soft chime of the bell on the clinic door made her jump. It was nearly 10 p.m. She wasn't expecting anyone. "We're closed," she called out, her voice laced with caution. The door opened anyway. 2 men stepped inside. They were large, dressed in dark, expensive suits that didn't fit their brutish frames. They didn't look like they owned pets. They looked like the kind of men who broke things for a living. The man in front had a long, thin scar that bisected his left eyebrow, giving him a look of permanent, cold amusement. Storm was instantly on his feet, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his chest. "Clara Hayes?" the scarred man asked. His voice was smooth, but with a dangerous, gravelly undertone. "Who's asking?" Clara said, her hand inching towards the phone on her desk. The man smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "A friend of a friend. We were told you spent some time recently with Judge Julian Croft. We'd like to know where he is." Ice flooded Clara's veins. The crime syndicate. The threat Julian had been hiding from. They had found her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice commendably steady. The man's smile widened. "Oh, I think you do. You see, the judge is a creature of habit, a recluse. For him to bring a stranger into his home, that's not just unusual. It's a message. It means she's important." He took a step forward. Storm's growl deepened, the fur on his back standing on end. "We can't get to him, but we can get to his new liability." He lunged, not at her, but at Storm. Everything happened in a blur of motion and sound. Storm barked, a furious protective roar, and threw himself at the man's legs. The second man moved to kick the dog, but Clara reacted on pure instinct. She grabbed a heavy glass jar of dog treats from the counter and threw it with all her might. It shattered against the second man's head, and he went down with a grunt of pain. The scarred man backhanded Storm, sending the dog yelping into a corner. Before Clara could scream, he was on her, his hand clamping over her mouth, his other arm a band of steel around her waist. He was incredibly strong. "Big mistake," he hissed in her ear, his breath hot and foul. "We were going to be nice." He began to drag her towards the door. She struggled, kicking and biting, but it was useless. Her mind was screaming a silent, frantic prayer. Julian. Suddenly the front glass of the clinic exploded inwards. A dark shape, a blur of motion, came hurtling through the shattered window. It was Julian. He was not the calm, controlled judge she knew. This was a different man entirely. His face was a mask of cold, lethal fury. His eyes were not stormy. They were black holes of rage. He moved with a speed and brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. He hit the scarred man like a freight train. The man's grip on Clara vanished as he was thrown across the room, crashing into a set of metal shelves that buckled and collapsed under his weight. Julian didn't pause. He spun, his elbow catching the second man, who was just staggering to his feet, in the throat. The man crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. The entire brutal confrontation had taken less than 5 seconds. Julian stood in the center of the ruined clinic, his chest heaving. He was dressed in a dark, practical jacket and jeans, a world away from his tailored sweaters. He looked not like a judge, but like a predator. He turned to her, his eyes scanning her, checking for injuries, his expression fierce and possessive. "Are you hurt?" he growled, his voice a low, raw sound. She could only shake her head, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind reeling from the shock. Storm limped to her side, whining, and she knelt to hold him, her body trembling. The scarred man was getting up, a look of murderous rage on his face. He pulled a knife from his jacket. "You should have stayed on your mountain, Judge," he snarled. Julian didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Clara, on the trembling fear in her face. He had seen this fear before in witnesses and victims. To see it on her face, to know he was the cause of it, was like a physical blow. His fortress of solitude hadn't protected her. It had made her a target. "You brought this on her," the man spat, advancing slowly. That was the breaking point. "You will not touch her again," Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper more terrifying than any shout. He turned to face the man, and for the first time Clara saw not a judge, not a recluse, but a man pushed beyond his absolute limit. The fight that followed was not a brawl, it was an execution. Julian moved with a disciplined, cold-blooded violence that was horrifying and yet strangely beautiful. Every move was precise, economical, and devastating. He disarmed the man with a sharp, brutal twist of the wrist, the knife clattering to the floor, an elbow to the jaw, a knee to the ribs. He dismantled the man with the same analytical efficiency he used on a legal case. Within a minute, both men were unconscious on the floor of her ruined clinic. Sirens wailed in the distance. He must have called them. Julian stood over the fallen men, his breathing ragged. The lethal fury slowly drained from his face, replaced by something far more devastating, a look of raw, gut-wrenching despair. He looked around at the shattered glass, the overturned shelves, at her, huddled on the floor with the dog. He looked at the chaos he had brought into her world. He walked over to her, his movements slow, cautious, as if approaching a frightened animal. He knelt in front of her amidst the wreckage. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse with a pain that had nothing to do with the fight. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a stray piece of glass from her hair. His touch was feather-light, reverent. "I'm sorry," he said. The two words were a confession, a surrender, a breaking of every rule he had ever lived by. "My world. I never wanted it to touch yours. I thought sending you away would keep you safe." "You should have stayed," she whispered back, tears finally blurring her vision. "That's all I needed to be safe." "I know," he admitted, his voice thick with sincerity. "Running from this, from them, it was a mistake. But running from you, that was a catastrophic error in judgment." He looked into her eyes and all the walls were gone. The judge, the recluse, the ghost. They all vanished, leaving only the man, raw and exposed. "When I saw them put their hands on you," he continued, his voice dropping to a raw murmur, "the only thing my mind could process was that the law was too slow. Justice was too civilized. The only verdict that mattered was getting them away from you, by any means necessary." The confession, so raw and unplanned, was the bridge she had been unknowingly waiting for. "I was so scared, Julian," she breathed, the words a shaky admission. "Not as scared as I was," he corrected her, and the raw truth of it stole the air from her lungs. "In that moment I understood something. My life of control, of order, of safety, it's an illusion. It means nothing if you are not safe. It means nothing if you are not in it." The sirens were getting closer. The red and blue lights flashed across their faces, painting them in fleeting strokes of color. The moment was about to be lost to the mundane, necessary chaos of the real world. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes, inches from hers, were filled with a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. "I can't protect you from my world by pushing you out of it," he whispered. "The only way I can protect you is to bring you to the very center of it, and never let you go." And then, amidst the shattered glass and the flashing lights, his lips finally met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate, raw, and full of the brutal, pent-up release of months of forced separation and silent longing. It was messy, demanding, and utterly real. It tasted of the harsh fear they had just conquered, and the sweet, terrifying promise of a shared future. It was the kiss that shattered his empire of silence forever. The aftermath was a controlled whirlwind of logistics, a world where Julian was once again in his element, but this time he wasn't pushing her away. He was pulling her into the center of his command. The police arrived, and Julian handled them with a quiet, unshakable authority that left no room for questions. He spoke in low, clipped tones, referencing statutes and legal precedents that had the officers nodding in deference. The two unconscious men were taken away, destined to disappear into the labyrinthine justice system that Julian commanded. He never left her side. His hand rested possessively on the small of her back, a silent, public claim. He wasn't the judge. He was her shield. When the chaos finally subsided, they were left standing in the wreckage of her clinic, the red and blue lights receding into the night. You can't stay here, he said, his voice flat, a final verdict. This is my life, Julian, she replied, her voice weary but firm. My work. My home is just upstairs. Not anymore, he countered, his gaze sweeping over the shattered front of her building. They know where you live. They know where you work. Until every loose end from my past is permanently tied, you are not safe here. He looked at her, his stormy eyes full of a new, quiet determination. You're coming home. With me. This time it wasn't a command born of cold logic. It was a plea disguised as a necessity. She didn't return to the silent stone fortress in the mountains. He took her to his apartment in the city, a place she hadn't known existed. It was another penthouse, another world of glass and steel and breathtaking views, but this one felt different. It was less of a tomb and more of a command center, and this time she brought her own Storm with her. Storm, the dog, trotted in as if he owned the place, his tail wagging, immediately claiming the most expensive rug as his own. Julian watched him, and a faint, genuine smile touched his lips. He is a necessary variable, Julian stated, and Clara laughed, a bright, joyous sound that echoed in the vast, quiet space, the sound of her soul finally coming home. Their life together began not with a perfect resolution, but with a delicate negotiation, a slow dance between his logic and her creativity. He would still work the insane hours his position demanded, but now when he was locked in his study, she would leave a mug of her strong black coffee on a small table outside the door, a non-negotiable comfort, and sometimes the door would open, and he would pull her inside, seating her in a comfortable leather armchair, just so he could work in the quiet presence of her company. She was teaching him to live outside the rigid lines of the law. He was teaching her the quiet joy of stability. Their first great test came not from the criminal underworld, but from the high society he had long abandoned. Rumors of the reclusive Judge Croft's new companion spread like wildfire through the city's legal and political circles. They saw her as an anomaly, a chaotic variable in the judge's perfect equation. The culmination came at the annual Bar Association Gala, an event Julian was legally obligated to attend. He hadn't attended in years. You don't have to come, he told her the night of the event, watching her as she stood before a mirror, looking uncertain in an elegant, simple black dress he had bought for her. I can handle them. Your world, Julian, she said, meeting his gaze in the reflection. You said you wanted me at the center of it. We faced them together. When they walked into the grand ballroom, a hushed silence fell. Every eye was on them. On the formidable, untouchable judge and the beautiful unknown woman at his side. Clara could feel the weight of their stares, the silent judgment. An older, influential judge, a man named Sterling, approached them, his smile thin and condescending. Julian, he said, his eyes flicking dismissively over Clara, we had all assumed you had permanently retired from civilized society, and you've brought a guest. Before Julian could deliver a cold, cutting retort, Clara extended her hand. Clara Hayes, she said, her voice clear and steady, her smile genuine and disarming. And you must be Judge Sterling. Julian has told me so little about you. The subtle barb hit its mark. It's a pleasure to finally put a face to the name he mutters in his sleep. Sterling's face flushed. Julian's hand tightened on her back and she could feel the suppressed tremor of his silent laughter. In that moment, in front of his entire world, she had not just stood by him, she had defended him using her own brand of quiet, disarming chaos. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. You are a beautiful, terrifying menace, he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. Later that evening, he led her out onto a private terrace overlooking the city lights. They see you as my weakness, he said, his voice a low rumble, a vulnerability they can exploit. And what do you see me as? She asked softly. He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. His expression was soft, completely unguarded, and full of a love so deep it felt as infinite as the city lights stretching out below them. I see you as my strength, he confessed. I spent my life trying to be the center of my own universe, controlling every variable. But you showed me that the true center of everything is connection. It's us navigating the beautiful, terrifying chaos together. You walked into my silent, ordered world, Clara, and you taught me that justice without compassion is just a set of rules. A life without chaos isn't a life. It's a waiting room. He knelt before her, not with a grand theatrical flourish, but with a quiet, deliberate seriousness that was far more powerful. He pulled a small, velvet-lined box from his pocket. "This is not a verdict, Clara," he said, his voice steady as he opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant platinum band. "It is a merger of two fundamentally opposite, but wholly complementary entities. I give you my life, my chaos, and my entire world, and I am asking for yours in return. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face as she smiled, a smile so bright it could rival the city lights. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Julian, on one condition." He looked up, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Anything?" "The cello," she said softly. "I want to hear you play." A slow, genuine smile transformed his severe features, the first true smile she had ever seen from him. "That," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he slid the ring onto her finger, "is a negotiation I am willing to enter." Their wedding was not a grand society event. It was a small, quiet affair held in the sun-drenched great room of the mountain cabin, the place where their story had truly begun. The only guests were a few trusted friends, and Storm, who served as the ring-bearer. Julian's only demand for the wedding was that the drawing of his hands be framed and hung over the fireplace, a vibrant testament to the woman who had seen both sides of him and had the courage to embrace them both. He never became a completely different man. He remained a formidable, intensely focused and powerful force in the world of law, but he learned to leave his need for absolute control at the door of their home. He learned that a life without the constant, thrilling threat of a little dog hair on the cashmere sofa was simply not a life worth living. And one cold winter night, a year after they met, Clara sat by the fire, a sleeping Storm at her feet, and listened as the deep, soulful, and beautifully imperfect notes of a cello filled the silence of the cabin, a sound of a man who had finally, truly, come home. Some loves don't just happen to us, they rebuild us from the ground up. They find the cracks in our walls and fill them with light. If this story of chaos and control reminded you of a love that changed everything, tell us about it in the comments. And subscribe so you never miss a story, because the greatest love stories never truly end. They just become a part of who we are.